They say that the recording is in progress.
We believe them. Hello, and welcome to our Cosmic Journey, episode 5. Today is the 21st of October, 2023, at exactly 6:43 p.m. here in Berlin, Germany. Hello, Trey.
Hello, Jake. It's 1843 for those of you in Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. We should be very European with our time. 1843. I still do this thing, like when we moved here, 24-hour time was very difficult for me. And so I was always
Okay.
like, what time is it? Now I can't switch back to 12-hour time easily.
Yeah, it does. I have to translate the other direction now. And the one that's really surprising is now that we've been here long enough, Fahrenheit has gone out the window.
Yeah, Celsius feels much, much more natural to me as well.
Yeah, it seems to be much easier. Like the increments are just easier to understand. It's like 20 is kind of like everybody's sort of like this is pretty decent.
yeah,
Um,
20 feels decent. 85 kilos is about the right weight. 1843 is the right time to make a video.
Weirdly, I can't do kilos when it comes to people's weight. Like when it comes to like body weight, like once you get up to that, like it's not for some reason kilos just never have that part of it has not stuck.
It's because you're not body obsessed and actually inappropriately body obsessed like I am,
I'm losing the
because
scale.
I get into too much in fitness. Today we have ourselves a little bit of a lighter agenda, and I just realized that I did not do something like that, so I'm going to stall for a second before I do this.
Well, the okay.
I got it. I got it. It's all
I
good. So
fucking off.
it's going to be pretty light discussion today. And really, so today's episode is called Clearing the Spike Trap. Trey, can you talk a little bit about what spikes are just very generally before we jump into the schedule?
Yeah, spike is a terminology that kind of grew up out of let's say agile software engineering methodologies. It might be in other things as well. I'm not sure. I actually don't know the origin of this term, but the way it was
Let's
described to
ask let's
me,
ask ChatGPT.
yeah,
I'll
I
do that while
asked
you're doing it.
ChatGPT, and I'll say what I think, how I visualize it, which is, and how it was told to me by my engineering manager who first introduced me to this, which is that you think of it like a stalagmite. Wait, that's the one on the ground, right? And then basically you chisel pieces off of it. So the idea is that you have something that's too big on its own, and so it needs to be broken down into smaller chunks so that they can be actually implemented at a reasonable pace. And we just had a lot of things that were quite large that needed to get broken down. And we can talk a little bit about that.
Ah, so the according to ChatGPT, of which it only tells the truth and nothing but the truth, the name Spike comes from the notion of driving a spike into the ground to explore what's there. Now, I would assume when you're going back to rocks, maybe the spike to do that. A
Oh, yeah,
spike
to
into the
break a rock
ground
apart.
doesn't tell me this. A spike into the ground tells me I'm laying railroad tracks. A
Yeah,
spike on a rock to break it apart makes more sense to me.
yeah, definitely the breaking apart the rock. Although I can kind of see like it's this kind of like long process where you sort of you put a spike, you put a spike, you put a spike, and eventually the rails. And I mean, I can make that metaphor work. I can make any
Yeah,
metaphor
you can
work.
make the metaphor work.
It's
Maybe
my
the
Piscean
train
nature.
goes to the location. Maybe the train goes off the cliff. We'll find out.
We'll
That's
find
that's
out.
kind
Stay
of
tuned.
stay tuned. So it's my
Also, oh,
yeah.
sorry.
Go
Go
ahead. No, no, no.
ahead. Also, part of the reason why I just wanted to explain briefly why this was a little bit of a shorter cycle is because I have been attending the occult conference here in Berlin with many amazing and wonderful colleagues, and just having wonderful chats. I have my see officially.
It's real. You've
It's
got a
real.
wristband. That
Yeah, I
means
might
it's
even
real.
go back there later tonight. I don't want to, but Jake says that I have to socialize. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. I will say that in 20, I'm already starting. This is very much me. I'm already starting to think about what our 2024 um, New Year's resolution should be. And I think one of them is about pushing ourselves in outside of our comfort zone when it comes to doing things that are social or kind of community-based events so that we can do a better
Connect a little bit.
job of kind of connecting and
Yeah.
connecting and building relationships. And Mr. Henry, put a pin in that, connecting and building relationships, because that's going to be part of what we talk about today. But first, before we get to that, let's talk about our feelings in terms of a check-in. It's my check-in question. Trey has no idea what I'm about to ask him. Here we go. Um, what if you were a plant right now, what plant kind of symbolizes you at this moment, or maybe you this week in this cycle? Or to be more, like maybe more clear, like if you had to choose kind of a plant as a metaphor for the week or for today, what plant would it be and why?
I feel like the question is geared around like what type of plant, but I'm gonna answer with a specific plant, which is the sorrel that we have on our porch, which has been devoured by something, and for a long time we had no idea what it was being devoured
This
by.
is this is where, by the way, I cut in a picture of our sorrel. So you're going to see a picture of our sorrel right now while Trey talks. So
Yes,
our
is
sorrel's
that
being
it?
devoured.
It's being devoured. And one morning, Jake and I woke up, and there was a pigeon on the balcony, just going to town on this sorrel. Sorrel, for those who don't know, is a leafy green. It's kind of fallen out of fashion because it's a little bit on the bitter side, but it's still used in Germany in a very famous green sauce that's made here out of a bunch of different vegetables. And so I grew it with this grand idea that like either making that or like using it in other culinary things because it's a kind of a little bit of a forgotten herb in the West, and then I grew it, and apparently I just made salad for pigeons.
Yeah,
So anyway,
or I
but
guess. Yeah, go
feeling
ahead.
a little bit pecked off at the leaves. Just it's been a lot of like pushing like my social boundaries and like just yeah, like energy is. I'm glad that a culture is over tomorrow, and I get back to my normal reclusive, don't leave this room mode.
Sorrel, so it's a sauce, it's a forgotten herb, or it's used for pigeon digestive health, as far as we can tell.
Exactly,
Because this,
it's the grass of dogs, but for pigeons.
yeah, the pigeon looked a little bloated. I have to say that was eating the sorrel. I don't know if that was a due to it eating the sorrel, or it was bloated and then therefore it needed sorrel because of gut health, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah. It's important to keep
Um,
on top of.
what kind of plant am I? I'm also
Yeah.
not going to answer the question as I intended it. So whose intention is this, anyways? Um, I feel like a tree that all of a sudden has had way too much sun on it out of nowhere and now is crispy on the leaves. And this reminds me of so Trey's parents own a decent sized property outside of Seattle. They had a lot of trees on the property, some of which were either dying, some of which were kind of encroaching on the house in a way that was actually dangerous. And so what they wanted to do was a kind of culling back of some of the trees that were either problematic or coming to the house. Well, they were all problematic for whatever reason. And I do remember there was this one tree in the front yard that was this huge shade tree. And once it was cut down, all of a sudden the tree behind it was getting all of this direct sun. And all of a sudden that tree was just like, and I, without going into great details of what's happening at HelloFresh, I am getting a lot of direct sun right now in ways that make me feel like I am being overnourished with the the thoughts and feelings of others. And I am withering and crisping under the sun. But the thing is, that tree that was taking all that sun, I take stock of it every time I go back to the property. We're going to go back for Thanksgiving, and it looks very healthy. It's all kind of adjusting. It adjusted itself, I think, to its new sunny circumstance. And I'm hoping that the sun kind of dims a little bit here in my life, much like Trey. I feel a little crispy around the edges for different reasons. And so you're getting a little bit of a crispy episode from us. So with that, good checking, everyone.
Yeah,
Lots of
good
claps.
check-in.
Yeah, good checking. Let's talk about what was on the schedule as vectorizing numbers and the firmament.
Firmament.
Okay, so we say the firmament, right? But you can, of course, say the firmament. You can say all types of things for
You
this.
can say it however you want. It's
Yeah,
just a word.
we were using, I don't want to talk about heart to heart right now, but we were using that the butler character's voice for a bit. Those of you old enough to know heart to heart would appreciate. Can you do
No,
the
you do it. You do it. You do it better than me.
well, all of a sudden, like, this is Mrs. Hot, like all that kind of a. So the firmament, I can't do it all of a sudden. I was doing it perfectly outside, and all of a sudden I
Yeah.
can't do it. Anyways, let's stop talking and let's start showing, because we need to move on very
We need to
quickly
move on real quick.
from heart to heart.
Yes. Otherwise, we'll end up in a heart-to-heart hole.
Heart
That's
to heart hole.
there.
Hart
Um,
to Harthole is our other podcast. You may miss that.
okay.
Hart to
So
Harthole.
let's see. Okay. I'm going to start with showing the end result here. Since that's the status part, I am going to do this because I'm going to click this button and I'm going to click this button and then this button. Voila. So, if you were paying attention last week, you might notice that this is slightly different, not drastically different. Everything that worked before still works again. However, you will notice that the
Eagle-eyed viewers will
eagle-eyed
notice that
viewers,
those numbers look different now.
yes. So these numbers are a typeface, which Design, aka Jake, has has selected from a number of candidates. For
Selected and licensed.
and
Also
like
part of the sunniness that hit me last week. Font licensing was a real topic last week.
yes,
You have to watch it. It's okay. If you get nothing else from this video series, hot tip: if you are going to use a font and you're going to put it into a digital product, you have to license it properly. Otherwise, if you do not license it properly, they will come back with a bill, and that bill is very high depending on your usage of that font. So you must be very, very careful.
yes, yeah. Maybe we could do a deep dive on font licensing or just software
No,
licensing in general. Procurement,
no, no.
like it's procurement. Like big companies have whole teams that just do procurement exactly for this
Let's
reason.
just say this. If you go to a website and you're like, I'm just going to buy the cheapest option for this. I'm going to buy this font, but I'm going to buy the cheapest option of this font. And there's like the desktop use of that font. And then you decide to put that online or put it in your app. The good people
Usage change.
of the good people of your font foundry do audits on these things, and they find these instances, and then they come back and they say, well, it seems like you've been using this font in this way for this long, and I've calculated a bill for you, and I'm just going to write it on this piece of paper and slip it across the table and have you get a lot of feelings out of that number.
Yes. So, but there's a really important piece to this, which is that so typefaces as they appear, there's several different formats. A lot of people are probably aware of this. That like if you have gone out and you've like tried to find typefaces and fonts for things that you were working on, you probably worked with TrueType fonts or Open Fonts, or there's a few different sort of formats. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they're all what are called vector based descriptions. So they're basic. Like you can imagine that, like it says kind of like draw a line from this point to this point, and then draw a curve from this point to this point, sort of like this, just much more complicated. And one of the things that is very difficult when you're talking about the layout of text, when you're doing something like a graphical, if you're laying out text like on a page, or like on a web page, or even like a printed page, and you have like blocks of text with titles and things like this, and you're just talking about styling and stuff like that and layout, there's a bunch of sort of rules about text layout, which are really good for that. There's things called leading and kerning, which are around how letters get spaced so that they look good and they feel natural, how they get spaced both vertically and horizontally.
Yeah, leading is vertical, kerning is horizontal. You can't. I'm a little square in the upper right hand corner, so I'm making big movements. Kerning, leading.
So
we do the leading and kerning dance. This is new on TikTok, by the way. If you do the leading and kerning
called
dance,
the leading and kerning.
Yeah, leading, kerning.
It's actually a new like workout. The leading.
Yeah. You want to increase your heart health? Let's do leading and kerning dance together.
Okay, yeah, and
we
you have to
do that now.
Right and lefts too.
Leading, kerning.
Okay, so now you have a new workout. You weren't expecting that from this video. So anyway, okay, getting back to my point, the whole reason for talking about that is because those rules are very good for laying text out when you have blocks of text, and they're actually harmful for trying to lay out text like you see here, where we need to have very fixed width things that are associated with graphical elements, where you have the layout of the text is not following normal text layout rules. So what the ideal, well, actually, I should say This is the way that I do it. I don't know. I can't speak for anybody else, or if it's the ideal way. But one way that you can do this is to turn those naturally vectorized symbols into another vectorized format, so that you basically get rid of all of that letting and kerning information, and you basically just have a very basic drawing. And then that basic drawing you can use to lay things out much more specifically or accurate to a particular thing. Also, text sizes are very specific as well. So usually when you have text sizes, you're talking about points, which is a text measurement so like an 18-point font is a certain size that's sort of independent of pixels or independent of print resolution. And so you get sort of rid of that as well, so that you can scale things smoothly as well. So before, there was a bunch of logic, for example, in the date time thing you see in the middle of the chart here, to make it so that you kind of you had like a small, medium, and large. Now this thing scales perfectly. So it's pixel-based scaling. I can't really demo that. Well, no, I can demo it. I'm about to show when we get into the first.
I think you can, because it's also the other part of your demo, which is called the Firmament.
Firmament. Yeah. So okay. So anyway, so this is what's here. They look great.
I mean, it looks normal. The thing here is that, like, it's not supposed to be particularly noticeable here, because it has nothing to do, like, the good thing here is that it doesn't do the wrong thing when Trey starts hitting up and down, because it is very easy to do the wrong thing by doing what Trey just talked about, where you're vectorizing these numbers.
So the other thing that, because I never showed this, I've only been doing this on the Mac, because the mic and camera and everything on my Mac is much better than on my Windows machine. But I generally am developing on my Windows machine, and on Windows, because the typeface was slightly different, it rendered slightly differently, and this is often the case when you're talking about operating systems and browsers and all this kind of stuff. When it says type, it starts saying things like, "Oh, I know what I need to do with type," and everybody implements that slightly differently. And so these characters were actually slightly cut off on Windows, which they now no longer are, because they are just base little drawings. Anyway, so that's that. But let's talk very briefly about something that we call the Firmament.
If it's a Firmament, it was Moida.
Before I go to this URL, you will notice that I put in that the URL for this is /dev/firmament. What that means is that this is a what they call a route. So this is a way that the server responds to a request, which will only work in the development environment. So later on, if you're watching these videos and we already have a product on the market and you're like, I'm going to go to the Firmament, you will not be able to do that, unfortunately.
Also,
but also it's not really useful for you.
If you're watching while this is a kind of full-fledged product, good on you, by the way, for moving from like episode 158 to number 5. And you're like, boy, what the hell was going on with them in episode 5? That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome from the future, theoretical person. So what is the Firmament? So the Firmament is our sort of tongue-in-cheek name for what's essentially a component catalog, what is often called a component catalog in both.
Well, before we go into that, just to be very clear, the Firmament, when it comes to astrology, if I have this right, and you can tell me how wrong I am in my research, basically there's a bunch of planets, kind of the traditional planets through the oh crap, the order, which I always want to say is Chilean order, but it's not Chilean.
Chaldean.
It's Chaldean order. I always want to say Chilean because I think it's the Chilean minors that gets in my head, the Chaldean order that goes all the way out. And then on the edge, if I remember correctly, that's where the Firmament sits before you get to God,
divinity,
right?
to the divine. Yeah. So the Firmament is kind of like, it's the fixed stars, like in an astrological perspective, right? Like the Firmament is the thing that's kind of like the most far out before you get to what is beyond the sort of yeah. And it has this kind of like, the reason that we picked this was because there's a little bit of this sort of like Platonic idea of like things from the firmament being this kind of like almost like a Platonic sort of world of forms kind of thing, where, you know, like further down you have sort of like the material implementation of something, but then further up you have this kind of like idealized form of it. So when you're talking about the firmament in this case, it's basically like these These are UI elements or UI components, or just components of the application, which are stripped away from their context, that allow us to do things like view them in a number of different contexts. So, for example, one of the things that we can do here is we can do on light and on dark. And this is really nice for working, for developing these things, so that you can actually see, what they look like when they lay out with an icon, what they look like when they lay out in different colors. This is just, we're just looking at buttons here, but it goes on and on with headers and text input areas. So these are very common, sort of like general, like regular old web stuff. But then there's sections of the firmament. So there's a section of the firmament called astrology. And so here you can see our new numbering system. And this is why I was saying, like, I want to show how this scales. So this is basically like pure pixel-based scaling. So you can kind of see what this typeface looks like when it's been turned into glyphs, as we call them, and then laid out at different sizes. And then here you can also see the date picker. Completely functional. So if I click on these buttons, so, you can see all of them are updating because they're all operating on the same piece of data. But here you have a very small version of it, and here you have a sort of medium-sized version of it. Here you have a big giganto version of it. There's also a version of the chart here for laying out in light and dark. As you can see, not everything
showed the light chart before. Yeah,
yeah. It's not fully done, obviously.
Yeah, and so also for those people who work within technology, you might look at this and say, like, well, this seems very much like a design system, and you're not incorrect. This is a design system, and as we are kind of designing these new experiences and getting those implemented, the first thing that Trey does is to make sure that they are kind of systematized. Well, the first thing I do is make sure that they're systematized in terms of design, and then Trey goes in and says, okay, if these are systematized in design through the what's in Figma, I can put that into code here, which are now these off-the-shelf components that I can pull and use as necessary.
Yeah, it also gives you a nice way of being able to do the lighting and the kerning.
The lighting and the kerning dance.
It gives you a nice way also to do things that are more like inherent in the system. Can I move this? I don't know how that's going to impact the recording.
I don't know.
Well,
just
anyway.
move it.
But there are the platform that we're using has a notification system. None of these are styled yet, but it's kind of nice because we have actually buttons where I can click on them, and again, these are not styled. These are like the default styles that the platform provides. But you can see that, like, we can do things like, for example, like pop up error messages or whatever, so that like different things that have different interaction points can be sort of like isolated and viewed individually for the purposes of development, but also for the purposes of sort of having, as Jake said, a catalog of these things. So I think that's maybe about it on that. Yeah,
nice. I love it. Well, now that we're full size, do you want to do the hot new dance of TikTok that everyone is talking about, which is the type dance?
And the current.
Let it. Kerning, let it, kerning, okay, never again. Thank you. So one thing that Trey's been showing is kind of how we are systematizing things, and I think in design it's funny, right? Because like in design, there is this kind of desperate need for us to get to UI as fast as possible. But if you don't do the kind of proper amounts of like careful planning and organization, what you can do with your design is accidentally create a bunch of software experiences that people can't really use and don't really love. And Trey had talked about how he was kind of going out and talking and like building community because he was interested in kind of strengthening relationships, much like for humans.
To be clear, I wasn't interested in that. You're forcing me to do that.
Yeah, well, it's good for you. Think of it as a good vitamin that you'll appreciate me later for it. You can be angry with me now, you'll appreciate me later. So much like for humans, that relationships we're really nothing without relationships, honestly. Like we do better when we have strong relationships, and that's true for designing software as well. And this is why we use this OOUX philosophy and what's called the ORCA process in order to do that. So without going into great detail, because this is a whole This is a whole thing that Sophia Prater
Wait,
would
didn't you show
be.
this? Didn't you show this?
I did show this, but
Okay.
what I was going to show here was that now we're going into, so these are the new things that we're talking about here. This is the planning around like what does a system of objects look like, and what are the kind of base relationships that exist in a system of objects within natal astrology, missing secondary progressions, missing other things. What do it start looking like here? So yeah, there's a natal chart, right? And I think everyone in who's familiar with astrology and astrology software, or just astrology in general, knows that a natal chart lays out a position of points, and those points sit within signs. There's aspects of their points, houses, lunar mansions, house systems. So all of this is all like kind of standard, and everyone really knows that. But I think that something that might be missing from astrology software, and this is kind of a hypothesis right now that we will eventually go test, is what is the native is the representation of the natal chart, and that native has life events, and life events create the possibility of progressed charts, which give you transits. Like this is not really well built into astrology software today. Astrology software today does, let me see if I can do this, does this part really well down here and starts to fall apart when we get to this part. And then if you start talking beyond just natal astrology into electional astrology, ignore this for a second. Well, actually, is this correct? This might actually be correct. I can't remember. All of a sudden, in electional astrology, things like alerts become much more important here, right? Like if you are going to form a transit or form an aspect or form a point and you care about that, there's ways in which we can surface that in a way that like just feels more natural and feels more connected within a system. So this is all about like connecting these things. And what I've been doing as part of this is doing the nested object matrix, favorite acronym, which is NOM, N-O-M, to go across every single object that we believe is in the astrology software today, and do so to compare all of the objects kind of one by one. So what does it mean when a house is compared with a house? A house has 0 to n houses that have adjacent or complementary meaning. So for example, house 1 is the native, house 3 is the native siblings. This level of detail is not, that's never really displayed in modern astrology software. So if the idea here, and this is where you have to kind of like squint your eyes or maybe close your eyes for a second and think about astrology like a astrology UI for a second. If I'm doing something with house 1, or maybe I kind of poke house 1, maybe house 3 lights up because if I'm doing interpretation about the native, house 3 about the native siblings might be very important. That's just one example. There are a boatload of examples here. And the most important example is when you start thinking about one chart compared to another chart, to which I wrote here, chart has blank charts. This is the magic square where lots happen. So the magic square goes down here where there's a lot of different like chart by chart things that can happen. And like, how do we help people create Davidson relationship charts, midpoint charts, progressed charts, things like that. So to the idea of planning and the idea of like kind of stepping back away from UI for just a second and thinking about like the system of objects that people interact with in software. This is really what the that's what the objective of all of that is.
Yeah, nice. I think it's also probably important for people to, because I think for me personally, it's sometimes difficult to think at this level of abstraction. And
Yes.
design often is operating at the level of abstraction to the point where you can take concepts and turn them into sort of basic building blocks, and then see how they compare to each other, and then develop those concepts. And that whole process is very theoretical. So if you were looking at stuff there and you were like, Wait, what are you talking about? That there's no like everybody knows that the first house is the native or whatever. That's not what Jake's talking about. What Jake's talking
Right.
about is there a relationship between the meaning of the houses and the type of chart that you're looking at, or the meaning of the houses as they relate to each other in particular contexts, right? So it's kind of, this is why he's saying you have to like squint. It's an abstract. It's an arbitrary abstraction for the purposes of being able to really dig into the details of everything.
Yeah.
I hadn't really dug into this stuff before too much, just a little bit, but then I watched
You
some
watched a very good
videos.
video.
Yeah,
Yeah.
from Sophia Prater, one of the terms that she uses for this, or she used in one of the videos that I watched, was this idea of like X-ray vision, that it just gives you this way to kind of like see through the full surface of the full body of the thing that you're working on, and really get a much bigger, clearer picture of how all of these pieces go together. And then later on, you kind of prune things out and you narrow things down so
Right.
that you can get to the things you actually execute on.
Right.
But by starting here, it's a process of starting with a good understanding of everything and narrowing it down, versus throwing some shit against the wall and then building on top of it and ending up with this like ridiculously overly complex model that you didn't think through some of the things early on. And so then you ended up with things that are just kind of like, I won't,
Like
I
like
won't, I
every
won't,
other piece of software that you ever use.
exactly. I
Honestly,
was just
every
going to
other
say,
stuff.
I won't read any particular software that's out there that's very popular and very expensive and very old, and
Yeah.
very beloved. But that, like you end up basically with kind of like screens of settings. And then when you're trying to do things like, oh, I'm looking at the charts of everybody in this family. I have a client and I've got all of their, got my client's charts and all of the client's family charts, and we're looking at comparisons and things like this. And it's like, it's very difficult to know like which chart you're looking at, or the comparison, like moving between comparing two charts from looking at a single chart, and then you want to progress that chart and then compare the progressed against the other one. And it just gets, especially with astrology, because there's such a broad, vast like space for
Right.
it. This process, I think, well, we're both hoping that this process will allow us to get to some maybe some tooling
Well,
around the process of astrology that is more
right.
natural and uh, more, I don't know, easy to
Just
use.
kind of more in tune with how people do modern astrology, even
Yeah,
though it might be traditional. Sorry,
yeah,
like the modern techniques for traditional or modern astrology. And
yeah.
the thing is that you might be saying, like, well, Jake, you're making a whole lot of assumptions here. What if people don't care about the relationship between house one, which is the native, versus house three, which is the native siblings? The point of this is there are stances that we're making in here around like where these objects can be connected, but a lot of times when I do this kind of thing, it's more to open up a discussion, and all of a sudden then I start asking a lot more questions, and those questions are much more informed, which is like, do you care about how the houses are related to one another? And I can go ask astrologers these questions, and I was actually just pulling up, like I write those as comments in the file, and there's a bunch of questions here around like that Trey and I were talking about, especially when it came to lunar mansions. And I started talking about like the cusp of certain lunar mansions. Do we care about the cusp of lunar mansions? And that got this down this whole thing of like, is this actually a practice? And then we went back to Ryan Butler to be like, well, what does Ryan Butler say about all of this stuff? And it's good because like it's a very inquisitive type of like 5-year-old take on these things, but not a ignorant take on it. It's a way to say, if I'm steeping myself in the knowledge here, and then all of a sudden I start trying to make connections, even connections that feel a little tortured, do these things actually net interesting or useful experiences for astrologers? And then we can go back to astrologers and ask them a lot of questions. And I know that like I don't have a lot of background experience with astrology, but I do use this process to get my knowledge up very, very quickly. And when I go into conversations with astrologers, I don't think I'm being embarrassing when I'm asking these questions. I think I ask a lot of very interesting questions that astrologers are like, I never thought of it that way. Let me think about that for a second and get back to you or whatever. It's just nice. It's nice to like just get all the assumptions out on the table.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's also important to point out that you're going through a learning process as well, and this is the learning process. But
Yeah.
the systematic approach to it, the goal of this systematic approach, like this is all process and the meat grinding aspects of it, which is the whole point of this podcast, or whatever YouTube thing. But the goal is to bend the software to you instead of you having to bend to the software. which is kind of like that's I think where we have been for a long time, is the idea that, it's like, well, I've got software and it's very powerful and it does a lot of different things, but I have to really like,
I have to think through how it does its things as
right.
opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you look at something like, if you're interested, dear viewer, to kind of like go a little bit more down this rabbit hole or whatever, you could like, if you're on a Mac, and you haven't already checked out Arc, for example, go check that out.
Episode 1, we advocated
Yeah.
for you to go download Arc.
Yeah.
We're going to bring it back on episode
And even
5.
if you're not on a Mac, they'll have it out for Windows relatively soon, hopefully. They've been working very hard on it. But you can also just go to the website and kind of read through their philosophy of this. And the experience of it is really, yeah, you'll get what we're talking about. Obviously if you're into like project management stuff where you have to do that kind of thing, like take a look at Linear. I think there's this, we've talked about this before, but there's this crop of like new software and tooling that's coming out that's really designed around really meeting the problem space where it's at, and then thinking really much more from a human perspective of how the software can really, and not in a like a clippy sort of way, like not with software being too clever by half, but in a way that says like, these are the things that people want to do and need to do, and how can we make those things joyous experiences, instead of you having to be like, I've got all these little tabs with weird little labels because I can't change them, and then I'm clicking between them trying to find that chart that I was trying to find, for example.
Trey might be referring, by the way. All I'm going to say is Trey might be referring to.
You can't even bring up a video still or anything.
No, Trey might be referring to. Oh, what episode number was this?
You really can't.
Okay, I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah.
Just go check out podcasts that show astrology practitioners like explaining astrology through software, and just look at what we're talking about. Like, is the software adapting to the astrologer's way of working, or are they adapting their style of presentation towards the software?
Yeah.
Go take a look, dear viewer.
Yeah.
And let us know.
When you get really used to something, there is a sort of reticence, like people that are listening to this and they are using software, they might say like, well, yeah, you can pull this software from my cold dead hands. But I will say that there's a lot less of those people that I've talked to in astrological circles, and a lot more people that say things like, we've actually directly heard this: the only reason I paid this much money for this software is so that I can only show the planets that I care about.
Yeah. And that's our, so if someone says you can pry the software out of our, like you can have the software out of my, what am I trying to say? Pry it out of my cold dead hands kind of thing. That's a job for us. And it's a purely marketing job. And I'm sure by episode, I'm going to guess 60, we're going to start talking about how hard marketing is. That is purely a job for us to like convince you, dear viewer, that we are an alternative, a viable alternative for you to think about how you can kind of move forward, even if you're using software for literally 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
be an alternative for you.
Yeah. And the other thing too is that there's a lot of different, like I still, I'll pop into other browsers on occasion. It's less and less these days because Arc has fixed most of the things that I had issues with. So I mostly work out of Arc these days. By the way, let me just to drive this point home. Arc does this really amazing thing. This is exactly in the category of like people working the way that they want to work and kind of meeting them where they're at in like how they do things, right? So I'm a software engineer and we're working on a product that is a web delivered product. So let me share my screen again.
While you get your screen sharing going, we were like, we're not going to have enough content for an episode. I think we've talked for 40 minutes now. This might be our longest episode.
We could just go on forever on all kinds of things. Okay, so you can see my browser window. This is Arc. And one thing that you might notice, let me pull up, give me a website, honey. Something safe.
Yahoo. What does yahoo.com look like these days?
I don't know.
You should have done yahoo.de. Oh, it's fine. I took you to D anyways. Akzeptieren.
So notice here that, so this, if you just went and downloaded arc and then you started using it, this is kind of like minus, all of my colors and my setup here and everything. You would come to this and you would see kind of like the browser sort of looking like it does, right? And there's a couple of things that you might notice. For example, there's no URL bar here, so they kind of save some of that real estate there. And there's like buttons that might be visible in other things that like other web browsers that aren't here, right? And so like if you're a software engineer, you might be like, well, how do I get to the developer tools? Well, you certainly can. You have to dig a little bit to do it, but like you do with most browsers. In fact, usually you just know the hotkey for it. But if you, on the other hand, go to a localhost URL, then what you'll see is, first of all, you'll see that it's showing the URL here as kind of like a permanent thing, because when you're in development, you care what route you're on. You need to see this all the time. And so if you're working in another browser where it's already made this decision and said like, oh, we either show the URL or we don't show the URL, we're not thinking about it in the context of like somebody working in development, then you either have one or the other.
It's pain at the tutor. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then they give you this kind of like little striping back here, which is kind of this like, hey, it's under construction, which that's not something that they have to do. It's not something that is inherently like critical to the software, but it's part of this like I'm like a little doozer when I'm in here. I'm like it's under construction. I'm shoveling.
You do a refresh. Doesn't it bounce when you do a refresh too?
Yeah. So the URL here kind of does this little bounce.
It's like, yeah, I refreshed, but it's the same thing.
And it's because sometimes when you refresh, it refreshes so fast when you're on localhost, you won't see the refresh. Like I just hit it, you definitely won't see it in the video. But then you get a little bounce of the thing. And also, all of your dev tools are here, so I can pop open a console. Oh man.
Oh, look at all these problems.
Ignore that.
Yeah, geez. I thought we were building quality software.
That's just because of the firmament. Here, I'll prove it.
It's fine. Anyways, you've done your job.
Okay. Great. All right. Fine.
Jeez Louise. Let the viewer go for all of this. Trey, I think at this point, Trey is trying to filibuster his way out of being social. So I'm going to end the video right now. Be well. We love you all. We hope you have a lovely day, whatever day you watch this video. Be well. Bye.
Bye.